Hey there, it's Andrea, and welcome to the Voice of Influence podcast. Today, author and speaker Anna LeBaron is back. She was on back on episodes like 7 and 8, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But I'm so excited to have Anna back. Anna is one of more than 50 children of infamous polygamist cult leader Ervel LeBaron, and he was responsible for more than 20 murders. Anna endured abandonment, horrific living conditions, child labor, sexual grooming. In her powerful memoir, The Polygamist's Daughter, Anna shares her courageous journey of escaping a life of control and secrecy, reclaiming her identity and finding healing and freedom. Her story is also featured in the compelling docu-series Daughters of the Cult on Hulu. Welcome back to the Voice of Influence podcast, Anna LeBaron.
Thank you, Andrea. It is such a pleasure to get to talk to you again and to catch up on everything that has changed and all the ways that I have grown since we first spoke. It's incredible to me as I was listening recently to that interview, just how many ways my life has changed since we talked.
Oh my
In good
goodness.
ways.
That's exactly why I wanted to have you back. I wanted to not only catch up because I love catching up with you, but also to share with everybody else the amazing things that have happened and the ways that our lives can evolve and change and the impact that we can have in, just by being faithful to what we're trying to achieve, like you have put in the work. You have put
Yes.
in the work.
Yes, I have worked very hard to achieve what I have to date, and done all of my part, as I like to say, and God has done all of God's part.
Mm.
Everything that felt impossible to me, I always put that in God's column. If it feels impossible, that's God's job. I don't even have to worry about it. But I do have to do the possible things.
Mm.
So, and I've done them. I've done them in countless ways that ah
You
it
know,
it feels inconsequential each little step you take, but when you look back, you realize just how giant those little steps were in the grand scheme
yes.
of things.
Yes. You know, we connected before your book was written, and I think before either of our books were published.
I think so, yeah.
And so I think I would like to just kind of like piece by piece a little bit, through the years, like what have you done actually? Because you had this compelling story, which I want to get back to that, to give people more context for this. But since we're here, let's keep going where we're at.
Mhm.
You had this important story and message to share, and you started where? I mean, where did this start for you? Where do you feel like it started?
I think it started with just the desire to share my story in ways that would be helpful to others. And that desire was inside of me for a decade or more before I ever even started writing my book. There were a lot of things that I had to overcome internally, just things in my mind and narratives in my mind that kept me silencing my voice. Just ideas that, like, for an example, I when I first started thinking about it, I felt like I had to wait until my mom passed away before I could write my book, because I felt somewhat responsible for her feelings of grief or guilt that would come about if I told my story, and she had to face that. Well, for those who have read the book, you know that I did not end up waiting until my mom passed away. The other thing I had to overcome was the voices, not the literal voices of my siblings, because nobody has said this to me, but I had this narrative in my mind that I have 51 siblings. Like, well, there's 51 children fathered by Ervel. I'm one of them. And, when you include all our step siblings as well, there's over 60 of us. And there was a narrative in my mind that said, Anna, you suffered the least of all your siblings, pretty much. Who do you think you are trying to tell your story? So there was a minimizing in my own mind of the heartbreak, suffering, and trauma that I had experienced. And what I've learned since is that this is a normal trauma response. If anybody's done any research on trauma-related therapy, trauma-informed therapy, you begin to understand that there's ways that we minimize our own pain and suffering in order to survive. So it's a survival mechanism. And that was alive and well within me. I was minimizing my own pain and suffering in order to survive. And the thing that I feel like that I see in hindsight now is because I was doing the work with a therapist, a trauma-informed therapist, when it was the right time for me, and that was when I had healed enough, I overcame that minimization of my own trauma and pain and recognized that my story was worth telling. And that even if I was the first of my father's children to tell their story publicly, which I have been, that it doesn't minimize their suffering or speak to their suffering at all. And I recognize all the ways that my siblings have suffered incredibly more than I have. And that's worth mentioning and talking about and acknowledging.
I think that is such a huge piece of insight for yourself, but for all of us. Like, who has a story that's worthy of being told?
Right, all of us. Every story matters. I was listening, and we said that during our first interview, that every story matters.
Yeah. Wow. So you had to overcome some things internally. Is there anything else you wanted to say about that?
Right. No, the healing that I've done, each step of the way in this journey has prepared me for the next thing that's come along on my journey. And I have engaged in the healing process with professional therapists for more than a decade, several different ones along the way. And I'm even currently still working with a professional therapist. There's things that get uncovered and ways that I have acted in protection of myself, ways that I find myself still a little bit in survival mode, and those things need to be addressed, but they have to be addressed when you feel a sense of safety in your body, and they can't be addressed before that. And so over time, and as I've learned and grown and read, I am an avid self-help book junkie, my sister calls me. And in each of the books that I've read, and I have stacks and stacks of books talking about healing and the ways that we grow and learn, I have done the work to bring myself to the place where more and more I can share my story without being re-traumatized in the telling of it.
That's huge. So I know that if you're experiencing that kind of pain, why go through the work? Why put in all that work instead of just going ahead and protecting yourself all the time? Like, what is the reason for actually addressing the trauma and trying to seek healing?
I can think of about 10 things just off the top of my head, 10 ways that my life as it is has been improved. And one of the things I think that is really important is that who I was created to be, who the person I have become, who I am today was always within me, always there. It's the narratives and the stories and the trauma and the suffering that clouds that makes it that darkens that or covers it up and doesn't allow the person that I was created to be to shine and bring forth to bear on everything that I do. And the more that I do what the first therapist I talked to calls, peeling back the layers of the onion, the more that I peel back those layers, the more the person that I've always been, that I always was, that God created me to be, with the gifts, talents, abilities, spiritual gifts, everything about me, the personality I was given, Enneagram number, all those things, they get to shine brighter. And prior to doing the work, prior to going through all of this, so much of me was hidden from view. So much of me was not accessible even by me to have an effect on the things that I do and the ways that I engage with the world, the people that I'm in community with, even my own children. There were parts of me that were inaccessible to even my own children. Now, to that end, I will say that the more I have healed, the more I've done repair with my children. Because of the ways that I was raised and the mindset that I had growing up, just the influences that I had that into my adulthood affected the way I raised my children. And I have some grief and regret about that. And so I've done repair with my children. Now they're all grown up. My youngest is 26 years old, which is hard to believe. I have 5 children and a daughter-in-law and a soon-to-be another daughter-in-law, and 2 grandkids. So I've done the work of making repair, of saying I'm sorry, of apologizing, of acknowledging the ways that I raised them that didn't work well. And the regret that I have is because I'm a mother. And I will say that one thing I've learned is you're a good enough mom, which that good enough mom is a phrase I learned from my first therapist. You're a good enough mom when you feel like maybe you're not doing as good of a job as you should be or could be doing. When those kinds of thoughts enter your head, like, oh, I should be better, I should be doing more, I should be whatever. If you have like the woulda, coulda, shouldas going on in your head, that is a telltale sign that you're a good enough mom. Mm. And I was a good enough mom to my children because I did the best I could with what I had at the time. But now that I know better, as Maya Angelou says, once you know better, you do better. And as I have grown and let go of some of the things and the ideas and narratives that caused me to parent in certain ways, I've been able to go back to my kids and apologize, make repair. And that is the important part, is the making repair part.
Wow. Yeah. I appreciate you sharing that, because I think that it is hard for people to dive into and actually confront the things that are most difficult. And so to have a compelling reason, an important reason, seems to be really key to being able to move through that process.
Yes. And one of the things that I've learned since we've talked last And I wear this little necklace here. Let me see if you can see it. It's a nautilus shell. And what I've learned, and the lesson from the nautilus shell that has helped me continue on my journey, even though healing is such a slow process. The nautilus shell inspires me because the little creature within um, is born in this shell, and as it grows, it builds a new chamber. And then once that little chamber is built, it moves into the little chamber that it's just built. And then it can't go back to the old chamber because it's too small. The little creature has grown too big for that previous chamber. And then it closes off that chamber and uses the gases and things that are trapped in there to help it move differently as it, floats in the ocean, or
Wow.
moves it, or finds its movement in the ocean. And that slow process of growth that the nautilus shell exhibits has been such an inspiration to me, because for so many years I have felt like I was just going in circles, like the Israelites wandering in the desert for 40 years. I'm imagining some of them saying, yeah, we've seen this rock formation before, we've seen these trees, this little bunch of whatever, these bushes. We're just going in circles and wandering through this desert experience. And instead of now seeing myself as going in circles, I see myself growing in circles. And yes, I do go back and see some of the same landscapes I've seen before. And as I've experienced the things that God has brought my way, I've grown every single time. I say that God uses, or God orchestrates events, circumstances, and people for our good, for the good of others, and ultimately for God's glory. And that has been the story of my life.
That's a really beautiful analogy. I'm curious what the container that you've moved out of. What's the container that you've moved out of and into at this point in your life?
Well, like literally, I don't live in Dallas anymore. So I live in the Cascade Mountains, um, in Washington State, in the beautiful Cascade Mountains. And so the container is much more beautiful than the big city of Dallas that I lived in for 17 years. And while I've been in grad school since 2021 or 2022, I can't remember. And I got a master's degree, and now I'm working on a doctorate. And so it just so happened that my son and daughter-in-law were getting into the place in their life where, when I decided to go back to grad school, they needed a helping hand with the grandbabies. Well, there was just one at the time, and now there's two. But they said, why don't you come and live with us while you're in grad school? And it just has worked out so beautifully for everyone that I get to be with them, be close to my grandkids, and pursue this dream I've had forever of furthering my education.
Wow. The actual physical space certainly makes a difference in what our brain can even imagine for ourselves. When we're in the same pattern and doing the same thing, and where we've been for a long time, it can be really difficult to imagine something different. So I can see how that would make a difference for you. What are you seeing for yourself now? Like, okay, now this is where you're at. Do you have a sense of where you're going?
Well, what I'm imagining that I'm headed towards is teaching seminary. But when I begin to write my dissertation, I want to write my dissertation at the intersection of religious trauma or spiritual abuse, and where that intersects with spiritual formation. And in this degree that I'm pursuing, it's a Doctor of Ministry in Formation and Soul Care, which is just so closely tied to my heart for the church, like the big C church. There's been so many abuses have happened in the name of God, not just in faiths of other religions besides Christianity, which we all can see, but also within Christianity. I mean, there's a reckoning happening now, even as we speak, of all these atrocities committed in the name of God that are coming to light, and people are being held accountable. And so what I want to do and the way I want to serve the church is to write on what do you do when you've experienced religious trauma or spiritual abuse, and you still want to keep a life-giving faith and life-giving faith practices. And spiritual formation, which is what the degree is in, my master's was in that, and now this one, are fancy words for saying becoming more Christ-like, increasingly more Christ-like as we go. What are the practices that will create the space for the image of Christ that we carry as believers to be able to shine brighter as we interact with the people around us? So that's my heart for why I'm pursuing this. That has been my lived experience. So I feel like that's the thing that I want to write about.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. So you really have come so far in the way that you describe your healing journey, and now to where you're at a point where you are ready to really provide additional resources and insight around that topic. But you also did a lot of legwork along the way. You're one of the most like persistent, hardworking people that I know in this space. And I'd like you to share a little bit about that, because I think one of the things that people kind of struggle with sometimes is they feel like they have something maybe they want to say, but they don't either have the skills to do that, or they don't have the platform, or they're inhibited by something more than just their own healing. So
Right.
can you talk to that a little bit about your process of like just putting in the work and figuring it out?
Well, taking advantage of opportunities that come to you for learning and growth has been the hallmark of everything that I'm about. When I was in business years ago with some friends, we had to write these bios for the website. And my boss at the time wrote when he wrote my bio and then I wrote my bio and then we kind of combined them, he described me as a personal growth activist. Because not only do I pursue growth and healing for my own self, I want that for others as well. And so I'm consistently, very reliably giving suggestions, or, listening to people talk, saying, oh, here's the book that I've read, or here's this thing that I attended, or, something you can do online, or this podcast I listened to. Always handing out resources like candy for people to be able to do their own, like, not self-taught. I don't think I'm self-taught, although I've done a lot of this on my own initiative. But the people that I have found that have mentored me, books, podcasts, just all these ways that are just available for free online that anybody can access. There's just so much information out there. But more than information, it's the transformation that has happened as a result of doing the things that I've learned, putting into practice the things that I've learned. The Apostle Paul says, practice and teach these things. And when I think about the word practice, it's not get it perfect and then teach. It's I'm a struggler on the path with you. I am engaging in the practice of these things alongside of the people that I'm serving. I haven't arrived at the peak of the mountain. I'm not the guru. You know, there's a in this storytelling situation that who was the person who talked about it that I heard about it first? Donald Miller, I think. You know, he talks about the guru and the struggler on the path, and you know, there's different ways of looking at that. I am for sure the struggler on the path. I'm still in therapy my own self. So haven't arrived. I'm not there yet. And yet on the journey, I can share with those I'm walking alongside of.
Yeah, that is definitely something that holds people back. The feeling like they need to have it figured out before they do something.
Mm-hmm. You know, you like feeling that I need to have all my ducks in a row, you know, well, my ducks aren't in a row for sure. And yet at the same time, there's so much that has been put in place so that I could come to the place where I'm at now. And I look back on those things and can see the fingerprints and handprints of God all over the events of the past leading up to where I'm at. And that allows me to have faith for the future. That, like, I would love to teach seminary, but is that in my future? I can't know this. It's what's in my heart, and it's what I would love to do. However, God might have other plans. And I'm entirely and wildly open to whatever God has. That's like, okay, that would, I have this saying with my sisters that we do this little get together at the end of every year where we write these letters for what we want and hope for in the new year. And then we always end them with all this or something more or
Oh,
something
yeah.
better, you know?
Yeah.
And so that, you know, something better, something more that God has for me, I'm so open to that. But where I feel like I'm headed, that's the thing that draws me into my future.
Mm-hmm.
The ways that I'm engaging in practices, engaging in the work, step by step, headed in that direction, but am open to course correction.
Mm. You're also somebody who I talk about takes seeking and making opportunities. Taking, seeking, and making. And
Mm-hmm.
you definitely do that. Yeah, all three.
Yeah.
You see an opportunity, you're not afraid to take it. You seek opportunities, and sometimes you make them for yourself.
Yeah. I mean, now that you mention it, I can see all those ways that those things have happened for me and in my favor. And I'm looking forward to more. But it's not because I'm special or anyone more worthy of anything. It's
Mm.
like seek and you will find, knock and it will be opened, you know. Those are things that you can rely on as
Yeah.
as I do all of my part, all the possible doable things. I'm not over here doing anything impossible, superhuman, superwoman, even though I've been called superwoman before. I mean, there was a period in my life where I was a single mom with 5 kids holding down a full-time job. I mean, that is superwoman. So, but that's not my context anymore. And I don't have that um, heavy burden of providing for my children on me anymore. And at the same time, I'm just your average everyday person doing the best they can with what they have. And nothing more is being required of me than what I have the capacity to do.
Mm.
And to talk about the psychology about healing and the way trauma affects your brain and affects your thinking. I was diagnosed with complex CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And the CPTSD rewires your brain in ways that are not healthy, and overcoming that and everything that we've learned about neuroplasticity, the ways that you can rewire your brain and make connections that weren't there prior. All those things about the left brain, the right brain, and the way these things come together to help you problem solve and think through things. I didn't always have the capacity that I have now. And I did the best I could with the capacity I had. And now, because of all the putting in the work to do the healing, the capacity I have has increased. My window of tolerance has increased. I have more power and control over the triggers. I have more bandwidth for the kind of thinking that is required when you're in a doctoral program. But all of those things happened little by little, slowly but surely, and got me to the place where I'm at today.
I wonder if would you mind going back to when you left and sharing a little bit about that experience? Because I think it's important that we all understand how difficult it is to leave a high control situation.
Right.
And to at the same time, and so we can have compassion on other people who are in those situations, first of all, but also for ourselves. And then also, where did you find the agency to actually leave?
Well, as I have pondered my own story and thought about, like, I was 13 years old when I ran away from home and escaped the cult. But what I need people to understand is that when I ran away from home, I wasn't trying to escape a cult. I didn't even know that I was in one, because when you're in the middle of it, that's your normal. That's life. That's just, oh, this is what we're doing. I didn't know I was in a cult. The thing that gave me agency, and I believe the impetus behind the need to get out of the house I was living in at the time, stems from the unjust experiences that I had gone through. When I was 13, we lived in Houston. Prior to that, we lived in Denver. And the ways, the unjust treatment that we had received while living in Denver, I tell the story in the book about the $50 that we were promised and then never received, and just how bitter that left me, knowing that other people who had not worked as hard as we did trying to earn that, and them receiving some of the benefit of our labor, and us not getting to benefit from that. That was unjust. And the fact that I was able to process that as unjust, even if I wasn't able to speak about it, we weren't allowed to complain. We weren't allowed to say anything or speak up for ourselves or anyone else for that matter. Speaking up got you too much attention and usually a beating along with it. So you learn to be quiet. But the bitterness that caused me at the tender age I was around that time, 11, 12 years old, just barely coming into that, teenage years. When we moved to Houston, where we lived when I ran away, the ways that we were being treated more benevolently, even though we were still in the cult, the person who was in charge in Houston treated us so much better. Like, we didn't have to dumpster dive for food. My mom could shop for groceries in the grocery store. It was just like we had the most normal life. And I'm talking, when I say we had a normal life, it wasn't anything normal. We were still in a cult. But what I say normal, I'm thinking my mom was able to shop for groceries and buy little brown paper bags and sandwich baggies to put a bologna sandwich in and some chips and an Oreo cookie. Whereas before, we were dumpster diving for our food, taking just whatever the dumpster had, day old milk, expired yogurt, melted ice cream, which was a delight and a treat at the time. And so in Houston, we were treated with enough dignity that it felt good. And when my father died in prison and the man in Denver convinced my mom that she needed to move her kids back to Denver, there was just a part of me that rose up and said, I don't want to go back to Denver where we're slave labor, dumpster diving for food. I would rather stay here in Houston. And when I decided to run away and leave my house, I had no idea what was next. I was 13. There was no way for me to imagine what's next or the consequences of what I was doing. And to give you an idea of how I felt among all these women and children, 13 wives and 51 plus children, in this cult spread out throughout the Southwest United States and Mexico, we were all moved around like little pawns. And once you got to a certain age, you would be sent off to go and work in warehouses and different places. There was so much moving around, coming and going of the people that when I decided to run away, I didn't even know that someone, anyone, least of all my own mother, would miss me. I felt invisible. Like I could just leave the house. And I knew my mom was going to go back to Denver. I already knew this. And I just thought she'll pack up everybody and leave without me. And she won't even, like, it wasn't a conscious thought, but I did not even think for a minute that my mom would even realize that I was gone. Mm. That is how invisible I felt during that period of my life. And so I did. I ran away. I left the house. The words my sister spoke to me on the phone, I have a half sister who was grown and had, kids of her own at that point. The words she spoke to me on the phone that day, the last ones I remember her saying was start walking. And so I did. And I started walking and here I am. It's been over 40 years now. And going back to that, wandering in the desert, that 40-year thing that is not lost on me.
Wow.
Always in the Bible, the word 40 is, whether it's 40 days, 40 years, it's a time of testing or trial, and I've been out now 40 years, 40 plus, and I've been walking it out ever since.
So I'm wondering, I know that one of the things that you talked about earlier was the concern about, is your story important enough to share compared to your siblings' story? And I'm wondering how over the last 8 years since you and I have talked, I know that you were very sensitive and careful about how you interacted with your family. And since then, your book, you did even more with your book since then. You and our conversation, actually, I just feel like we need to tell the audience right now, if you don't know, that the conversation that we originally had was with Ruth Warner, your cousin, mm-hmm. Yes. Who also wrote a book. Mm-hmm. And that was a very complicated situation. But also you've had a few interviews with her on really big podcasts and mm-hmm. big platforms since then. You've done a lot of other things. You've had the Docu-Series, Daughters of the Cult, and it was just really me knowing how careful you've been and how much you care about that relationship with your siblings. Watching that series was really special to see those connections and those people speak mm-hmm. because they've been able to speak since you did.
Yes.
I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about that relationship that you've had with your siblings and how you've cared for that in your family in general, I guess. How you've cared for that. How are those relationships now?
Well, I um the the dynamics in the relationships within our family are just like in any family, they're always changing. You're growing. Everybody's on their path of healing and navigating through what life has thrown at you. In every family, no matter which family you have, it's not just because we're born and raised in a polygamous family that there's
It's
any
true.
different. And so my relationships with my siblings have been on a healing path and on a healing trajectory. And the ways that I have tended to those relationships and at the same time not allowed their thoughts and feelings about what I choose to do to govern what I choose. There are a lot of my siblings who feel like our story should just stay in the past. And I feel differently about that. I think that stuff that's just shoved into the past and, locked away, never to be seen again, is not always the healing path. And what the past is never really in the past. We carry it with us everywhere we go, and it affects us as long as we're in denial or dissociated from it, distracted from it. Those are all ways of coping, and all very good ways of coping when you don't have the capacity to do the healing work. And those ways of coping are good and right and are a part of the process. I used those ways of coping for all the years that I needed them.
Mm.
And then once I didn't need them anymore, I was able to let go of them. And being able to share my story has been part of the healing journey for me. And so when I wrote the book, I was very careful to only tell my story as much as I possibly could. I put blinders on, and unless you were in the room with me experiencing the same thing, I didn't even name the names. I tried my best not to tell my siblings' stories because those are theirs to tell when they're ready, if that ever comes about. And for some, it might not.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand that. And so me getting to the place where I was comfortable sharing my story, and when you read, they always tell authors not to read reviews on about their books. And it's really true, you shouldn't, but I have in the past. I've snuck in and seen a few of them. I get criticized a little bit for the way that I told my story because I don't go into all the details of who did what to who, when, why, and where, and how.
Mm.
All the salacious details about the murders that happened and all the sister wife drama, which if you've watched the show Sister Wives, there's sister wives drama. There's no getting around it. Even if while you're in it, you have to pretend like it's not there, because you do have to pretend like it's not there. And just as a side note, anybody who's watched that show Sister Wives should know that Christine Brown is my cousin. So
Okay.
we've never met. I would love to
Huh.
meet her one day, especially now that the results are in, and that polygamous relationship didn't work for any of them. As long as you're faking and pretending like you're happy, it works, quote unquote. But as soon as you stop faking and pretending, the truth comes out.
Mm.
And we've all watched that unfold. But again, when you're in that situation, there's so many stories that can be told on others, but that's not my place. Now, years fast forwarding, the book came out in 2017, and the docu-series came out in January of 2024, so just over a year ago. In the docu-series, they do tell other people's stories, but they're telling all the stories that are already public.
Mm.
This is already public information. And again, I felt like out of all the interviews that we've done, preparing for the docuseries, my sister Celia and I had the most interviews, I think. There's that, we sat on that couch for many, 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 many days.
Really?
And in two different times, once in the winter and once in the early summer. And,
Oh,
everything had to be the same, and our outfits had to be the same, and our hair, makeup, and, between the filmings, they were like, keep these outfits, they had to take pictures of us so that we could recreate the exact outfit, the exact jewelry, keep your hair the same length as much as possible,
that's so fascinating.
So in that situation where my sister and I are telling the story in the preparation, because I think we were in preparation for like 2 years almost, talking to the people who were going to be creating it, interviews, like countless hours of interviews in preparation, because this is a big story to tell,
Mm.
and getting it right was important.
Mm-hmm.
So in that preparation, my sister Celia and I came to the place where we felt like one of the things that we wanted to accomplish in the telling of our story on the docuseries was explaining to people how you can become so brainwashed
Yes.
and compelled to do some of the atrocious things that my father's cult was responsible for. There's documented 28 murders that were carried out by cult members and followers of my father, including some of his underage children. And in the preparation for it, it kind of became really evident to us that the narrative about Ervel's children that was out there in the world was that Ervel's children were bloodthirsty killers. That's the narrative. And every time the LeBaron name came out in public or on about anything, Ervel's name is dragged in, and all the atrocities dragged in, and the names of our siblings, splashed across the headlines again and again about all the things they had done.
Mm.
And what we wanted to do by telling this story in and through the docuseries is just announce to the world it was the early 90s when my father's cult burned itself to the ground. And there was not a single person left who believed that my father was a prophet. And since the early 90s, every one of my siblings who survived, and not all of them did, and even the ones who were imprisoned, who are still imprisoned for carrying out the murders my father ordered, not one single one of them continue to believe that they have to carry out my father's orders and the hit list that was put out there. And all of us, every one of us, without a single exception, are creating lives for ourselves since then that we can be proud of. And that's the narrative that we wanted to put out there. And even at the very last scene of the docu-series, there's a series of statements that are made that, there's not one single one of Ervel's children that believe in his teachings. And I hope that message was received loud and clear by the people who perhaps still felt some fear.
Yeah.
Who still had a little bit of that residual what if, because none of that is true anymore. And we talked about, once you know better, you do better earlier. Every single one of my father's children that survived, and even the ones in prison, figured out, knew better, and then did better without exception. Now, I will say, some of my siblings struggle with mental health issues. There's no way to get around that. But to the capacity that we have done better with our lives. And I am so proud of my family today.
It's amazing. It's amazing that you could say that everybody. Can you reinforce for us or even just illuminate for us how easy it is or how difficult it is to get out, but how easy it is to fall under when you're in that kind of environment to to be under that, I don't know, the spell of the cult leader? Why is that so easy? So many people, I think, look at situations like that and say, oh, I would never be
Right.
able to believe that or
Mhm.
whatever. Please
Yeah.
dispel this.
I mean, I think that anybody who's experienced abuse or an abusive relationship, narcissistic relationship, there's a great book called The Betrayal Bond that where you kind of get locked into these ways and patterns of thinking based on the treatment that you receive. And there's just so much psychological damage that happens in these high control religions. It's psychologically it messes you up in a way that you lose that internal voice that guides you and that keeps you on a better path. And you lose that ability to trust your intuition, to trust your guts, to let's put it that way. And you lose your way as you're following blindly behind these people who have control over what you think, what you feel, what you do, who you see, where you go. When all of those things are, all that agency, as you called it earlier, is removed from you, you blindly follow. And not because you're a wicked, horrible, evil person.
Mm-hmm.
It's that when those things are removed from you, it leaves you open to these kinds of things that later, once you realize, the effects of it, and you can think clearly for yourself, leaves you with so much regret. And I will say, we were born in it, raised in it.
Right.
And the psychology behind the what we experienced as children, abandonment, neglect of every kind you can imagine, and some you probably haven't even thought of. Every abuse you can imagine, and some you might not have thought of. Abuse, neglect, abandonment, trauma, complex trauma. Those things stunt your growth, both mentally, emotionally, spiritually, psychologically, physically. They stunt your growth in every way, and they don't allow you to grow into and become the kind of person who can think for themselves.
Mm.
However, we did grow. And, psychologists now know that it takes about 25 years in a healthy growth environment for the prefrontal cortex to become fully online and fully engaged, allowing you to make good choices and decisions for your life. And some of my siblings were caught up into this religiously traumatizing experiences where they were committing murder on behalf of my father. Before one of them was still a minor, 17 years old, barely educated. Like most of the boys taken out of school around third grade as soon as they could be put to work.
Mm-hmm.
So slave labor was a thing. And so you imagine growing up that way, your capacity to think is stunted,
Mm-hmm.
and then finding yourself doing the things that they did. Now, thankfully, I was never called upon to do that. I got out when I was 13. I consider myself one of the lucky ones because I got out at that age. One of the things I said in the filming of the documentary that was edited out, which I'm still salty about,
Yeah, please share.
um, is, I've always felt like I couldn't speak for my siblings. I didn't want to tell their stories. I didn't want to speak for them or put words in their mouth. So I said, I can't speak for my siblings, but I can speak up for them and help the world understand why and how they did what they did, to engender some compassion for these events that took place now 40 plus years ago. The events that so impacted my life happened June 27th, 1988. That day, that became known as the 4 o'clock murders, was still affecting me even up to a year ago. And I've been working with a therapist all last year, all of 2024. I worked with a therapist who specializes in cognitive processing therapy on the events that took place that day, because there were still some things about those events that were impacting my life in very negative ways. And I haven't talked about this much because it hasn't, it's almost better to wait until you've healed to talk about some things. But my whole life I have struggled with agoraphobia. And not that I couldn't go outside. I could go outside, get in my car, drive to the store, grocery shop, but there was always this undercurrent of anxiety until I got back home and inside the house. I love to gallivant. You know that more than anyone because I've been in your home gallivanting across the United States. But there was an undercurrent of anxiety until I was back home. Being out, the little way that this agoraphobia kind of played out in my life was that I could go outside, but periods. Go outside, get in my car, go somewhere, go into the store, get back in my car, get back to my safe place. But being outside, quote, for no good reason is what I struggled with. Just being outside to go for a walk. I recall, and my children can verify this, and it wasn't conscious at the time. When I was raising my kids, it was a subconscious decision that was being made that didn't allow me to play outside with my kids very often. I did not feel safe outside for no good reason. And growing up, we were taught not to be afraid. We were taught to be afraid to be outside. And then everything that we were taught to be afraid of actually happened June 27th, 1988.
Yeah.
And that solidified that, outdoors, outside, the boogeyman, the scary thing, and those really cemented it for me and prevented me from living a more full life that I could have had all these years. And I didn't even recognize that this was an issue for me because I did go to the grocery store. It didn't debilitate me and keep me housebound, but it did debilitate me in ways that I wasn't aware of. I didn't even become aware of it until I had my grandchild, my first grandchild. And my life shifted in such a way that I didn't have to work as much and I had a little bit more free time. And where we were living, there was this fun little lake close by where we could take walks, And for a year when we lived there, I remember thinking constantly, we could go on a walk, we could go feed the ducks, we could da da da. And I would imagine things that I wanted to do with my granddaughter that were outdoors. But for some reason, every day things would happen, time would pass, and then it's all of a sudden it's too late, it's already dark outside, we haven't made it outside yet. And this happened so many times over and over and over for that whole year that we lived there, that I finally started getting curious about it. Like, why do I want to take her on a walk, but then don't do it? Why do I think, and I went out and bought her a bicycle. I bought myself a bicycle, because somebody was going to have to keep up with her once, she learned. And I can recall on just one or two hands the number of times that we actually went outside that year. And just that awareness of this conflict within me of what I wanted to do and what I actually did. I realized I did not have the capacity to carry out the things that I really wanted to do. I didn't have the internal capacity to carry that out. And one day we were going to go to this little children's zoo, and I decide we're going, and I get in the car, I buckle her in, and we're driving, and I'm having a full-blown panic attack on my way to the zoo. And I'm just sitting there in the car driving, realizing, because by then I had enough therapy, I knew what was happening. And so I'm talking myself through this, like knowing that these emotions are like a wave and that they will pass. So I'm having a full-blown panic attack, driving my granddaughter to this zoo, which is outdoors, and yet there was, that book, The Body Keeps the Score. My body had kept the score all these years, and it knew that we were not going to be in a safe space being outdoors, for no good reason. And so, I worked my way through that. I talked my way through that. I, therapized my way through it. And we did. We went to the zoo and we had a great time. She got to feed the giraffe, the lettuce leaves, and it was just so fun. And I have videos of it. But she didn't know the struggle that I went through in order to provide that experience for her. And so when we got here to Washington State and I got all the stuff figured out and found myself a new therapist, my niece, who knows me really well and has watched me struggle with this, suggested this book called Getting Unstuck from PTSD. And it's all about cognitive processing therapy. And I went to this therapist, found the first one with availability, taking new patients, had an appointment. I was like, okay, you're it. This is the book. I got to go through this. And this is what I need to address. Very specifically, like, here's my marching orders.
Yeah.
And so we spent all of 2024 working through that book about the events that happened June 27th, 1988. And I am free of that fear of being outside for no good reason. And now I live in the mountains, in the Cascade Mountains. I get to go outside and take walks with my granddaughter anytime we want. We both have bikes, she's grown out of the little balance bike and now she's on a two-wheeler and I have to struggle to keep up with her. But at the same time, I wasn't ready to do that work until I was ready. And noticing the ways that my internal dialogue was holding me back, where I felt stuck, noticing those things, and then being willing to vulnerably share with another person, in this case, a licensed therapist. Like, here's where I'm struggling, here's what I'm noticing, here's where I'm stuck. Help me untangle this. And spending a year going through that book with my therapist has unleashed so much inside of me and so much more capacity for doing the work that I need to do to prepare myself mentally, but just doing all this work and creating new neurological pathways, giving me more bandwidth, more capacity for thinking deeply, so that I can do the work that I'm called to. God has been bringing me resources and help every step of the way that was addressing me where I was at the time, and that were actually helpful for that season of my life. And one of the things I learned from A.W. Tozer, which I don't have the quote perfect, but he says, God is always previous to any right response that we have towards him. He's always going before us, lining the path, illuminating the path that we're supposed to walk on. And I have faithfully followed that path, looking at just enough light for the next step. And I believe that that is the case for each one of us. My path is going to be wildly different than anybody else's because my needs are so different. But everybody has their own path. And when you begin to look for the ways that God is moving in and through and around you, through your circumstances, people, and all the events that happen in your life, look for God's hands, look for his fingerprints, his handprints, guiding the way, directing the path to what's next for you. Because that's all I've done all these years is what's the next thing? What's the next step? And then take that little step.
Wow, this has been really, really delightful. I mean, and important, I think, too, to learn more about your journey, this voice of influence kind of journey that you've been on, because there are so many things that I think we can allow to get in our path, that are in our path, that we have to kind of navigate, deal with. And your story is a very important one. And I know that the work that you've done already is important, but the work that you're going to do in the future is also important. And you are helping shape the future by doing that.
That's exciting to think about.
Anna, is there anything else that's just here and present with you or do you feel complete?
Well, there definitely ways that I am a work in progress right now. And because this is so fresh and new, it's a little bit hard to talk about, but I'm going to talk about it anyway because I think it's important. My family of origin story is what I've been talking about since 2007, when I told my story for the very first time in a public setting. Almost 20 years. And now that I've achieved this master's degree in Christian spiritual formation and leadership, working on a doctor of ministry in formation and soul care, some of the things that I'm having to navigate now, which I did not have capacity to do prior, as I'm studying the theology and the things that, the spirituality behind the spiritual formation movement, all of that. Two of the books that we've had to read have really brought up for me into the forefront my spiritual family of origin story, which in my book, I talk about the little Christian school that I attended where I came to know Christ. And one of the things that I don't mention all the time, and I feel like I did it for wise reasons and didn't talk about it for wise reasons, is the spiritual abuse that I experienced at that little Christian school that was very fundamentalist, legalistic. It was a very hard way to come to know Christ. I say that I left there after 6 or 7 years, graduated from that little high school. I left there with Jesus and some very good friends that I have to this day, but very little else in the way of spiritual growth because of the extremely abusive, spiritually abusive circumstances.
Do you mind describing or giving us an idea of what that means or looks like?
For example, I mean, it's hard to talk about.
Yeah, well, you don't have to.
No, I do want to. For example, there was shaming that was done publicly by the pastor, by other leaders, that was completely unnecessary and dehumanizing, not just of myself, but my friends. We were all teenagers doing teenage stuff, and the public shaming that happened, not just once, but that was very ongoing, was damaging. And I'm talking about the tip of the iceberg. That's one example. I experienced it myself, and I say I had to escape a Mormon fundamentalist cult, you know, I had to escape Mormon fundamentalism, but I also had to escape Christian fundamentalism. I wanted to go to a Christian college after I graduated from this little school, but the pastor wouldn't sign my application because he had theological differences with the school that I wanted to attend. So here I am, a Christian, wanting to go to a Christian college, and no, you can't. That's that's high control, high demand.
Yeah.
You have to stay here. You know, you were, planted here, so this is where God has you. You can't leave. Those were the messages. And again, this is the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more that happened that was so damaging to my faith and to my growth, my spiritual growth as a believer. I eventually did get to go to that little Christian college, and looking back on that experience, I have to laugh because it wasn't any better as far as the spiritual abuse that was happening there. It was just
Yeah.
as high control and high demand.
Wow.
But we can all look back with, in hindsight, and
Yeah.
things that we couldn't see at the time. And there's grace for that. There's mercy for that. By the skin of my teeth, during my teen years, it was being talked about sending me to Bill Gothard's headquarters in Chicago. By the skin of
And
my
I
teeth.
know this. I know what that means. Can you explain what that means?
I mean, just go watch that Netflix documentary, Shiny Happy People.
From one docu-series to another.
I mean, I escaped that by the skin of my teeth.
Wow.
There's just so much that about my spiritual family of origin that I'm now wrestling with.
Yeah.
And I have very wisely not talked about this publicly. And now that I'm in a place where I'm putting context to that through the training that I'm receiving at this level, master's and doctorate degree, where I'm studying the theology and the psychology and all of that behind it, where I have a better understanding of the people that were involved, I can have more grace and mercy. My family of origin and my spiritual family of origin both were horrific stories that nobody should have to endure. But the reality is that I was shaped and formed by those experiences, and having to undo the damage and the harm that was caused, whether it was intentional or unintentional, the damage was caused and the harm was done. And that has to be addressed.
Yeah.
And I want to practice what I've learned that was called a generous orthodoxy towards my brothers and sisters in Christ who did these things, and give them the benefit of the doubt. Many of them have already passed on. They're not even there to even be able to apologize or grow out of that. And there's so many ways in which, by saying these things, I've been journaling about them for a decade or more, but speaking publicly has been something that I have decided that not speaking publicly about them would be the best way, until I got to the place where I felt like I could say things in a way that was generative and hopeful, instead of from a place of bitterness, which I experienced a lot of, and rightfully so.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
And so I'm wrestling through that. To wrestle the angel is to commit oneself to what Tolkien called the long defeat, and in losing, to receive a blessing that may look to others like a shameful limp. And that's what I hope I'll be able to take with me moving forward as I'm doing this wrestling with this topic of experiencing spiritual abuse in my spiritual family of origin. I will wrestle this, and when the day breaks for me and I walk away with a limp, may I be found faithful.
It just says so much about who you are and your journey, that this is where you see yourself now and where you're trying to go with your dissertation. This is how you can still hold on to your faith even through so much trauma and difficulty, which I think is actually very, very difficult. And I'm really interested to read your dissertation when you're finished, because I do think that there are a lot of people that struggle with experiencing difficult, high demand, high control situations, and then ever wanting to come anywhere close to something like that again.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a time and a place for creating distance between those spaces where high demand, high control is the norm. And there is a time and a place for that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's healthy and good.
Yep. You have to be in a safe space to be able to do the healing.
You know, people
Like
talk about there's this word deconstruction that happens. And I really hope that people will hear my heart when I say that deconstruction is absolutely essential for people who have experienced high demand, high control religious experiences. And I don't want people to be afraid of people deconstructing. Here's how I see it. Take all the
Deconstructing
experiences.
belief, like
Right.
what is it that I actually believe, and all
Yes.
that, right?
Take all the experiences, all this negative things that happen in these religious contexts, throw it in the middle of the, light a match. Let me sit there with you. Let's pour gasoline and get that thing burning as hot as we possibly can. And here's why. Everything good will remain. Let's burn it to the ground, because all that nonsense will burn in a fire. The good remains. And for me, I've deconstructed a lot of things over the years, but I've never deconstructed my faith in a good God, in a loving presence, in the good guidance of the Holy Spirit, in Jesus. These are things that have remained for me, even though we've lit the fire. Let it burn itself to the ground, and then let me sit there and sift through the ashes with you and find the good things that will remain.
Anna, I just love that we have a connection. I love that we have a history. I love that we're continuing to this connection, and I want to continue that for sure.
This is a conversation that we'll keep having.
Yeah, definitely. Can you let us know how people can get in touch with you, or follow you, and all the things that we need to know about hearing your story and seeing your story and all those things?
Well, when I started grad school, I kind of had to let go of social media, growing my platform, like
Wow.
all of that. I post on Facebook on occasion on my personal page, but everywhere else, I'm still there. I just am not active, just because I had to let some things go in order to pursue this. And so when it comes time, I'm already in talks with the publisher about publishing my dissertation as an academic work, and possibly rewriting it as a more spiritual living kind of general population work. And so when it comes time for that and publishing those, I'll definitely be back on social media, because that's what you have to do. And so if you want to follow me there, everywhere, I'm Anna LeBaron on every social media platform. The last one I was active on was TikTok. So there's a lot of content there. During COVID, I got very active on TikTok.
Yes, you did.
And had a lot of fun with it. And then had to stop as soon as, because it was demanding so much of my time.
Sure. Yeah. Time and
And
energy and
yeah,
mental capacity too, I'm sure.
yeah. And so there's a lot of content out there that I've done in the past, but not a lot recent. But on my Facebook page, I do post on occasion. That's just all the bandwidth I have right now. So if you want to follow me on my personal Facebook, that's where I spend a little bit of time when I have time.
Yeah.
So so that's a
But
change.
we can, yeah, that is a change. Yeah, that's part of what you threw yourself into and did the work to get your book published and marketed. But now we can also find your book in various
Mhm.
places, I
Yeah,
know. And
it's available. It's in its fourth printing,
oh, that's
and
great.
it's available anywhere books are sold, at your local library. It's on Audible. Have these Libby apps, and Hoopla, I think is the other one, where you can listen to it. I read
Yeah,
the Audible edition, so I can read you the whole story.
I love it. I love it. And you can watch the Daughters of
Right,
the Cult on Hulu.
right, right.
Hmm.
And if you decide to read or watch or whatever, and you want to interact with me, you can send me a private message or post and tag me, and eventually I do check them on occasion. And so, like recently, I somebody got a message like a month ago from somebody who had read the book, and I got to reply to them, but a month later. So anyway, I would love to engage in the ways that I have capacity for.
Sure. That's great. Well, Anna, what's one last piece of advice you'd like to give somebody who'd like to have a voice of influence?
Hmm. Just take the next step. That whatever step is being illumined on your path, opportunity for growth, for healing, learning. There's 1,000 ways that God has led me on my path, each different and unique. And I trust that God will lead each one, illumine the next step. And it's in taking those little steps in the direction that you feel led that change happens.
Thank you so much for your time and sharing your story and your heart and your transformation with us. It's been a real delight and pleasure.
Well, it's been a pleasure for me too.